Welcome to the 20th Century History series. All podcasts are released under a Creative Commons license and are free for non-commercial use. Each podcast is self-contained and does not require listening to previous episodes. The author is Kim Sonderborg, editor is Philip Bird, and the editor-in-chief is Dr. Liam Brown. All episodes are read by Kim Sonderborg.
Social effects of World War I. World War I affected the lives of people on a scale never seen before. Previous wars had most often been limited to the battlefields. The soldiers would go off fighting and return either victorious or defeated. But World War I became a total war, involving also the societies behind the fighting armies. The mere scale of the war, with over 10 million dead and a multitude of soldiers returning wounded either physically or mentally, left deep scars in most European families. The loss of men in the trenches, the naval blockades, and the wartime industrial focus on war materiel meant that the nation's economies had to be reconstructed, and socially life underwent deep fundamental changes. Because of this, it is not wrong to characterize World War I as a watershed event. The war brought people into the industrialized, democratic, and modern 20th century for good and bad. Each country experienced the political, economic, and social changes after World War I in their own ways. In this examination, we will focus on some of them: Germany and Austria, Britain, the USA, and the USSR. It would be nice to also include France, Italy, and the Ottoman Empire, but the first mentioned countries are those that show the most obvious changes in their development after World War I. The main focus is social effects of the war, meaning the effect on people's everyday lives. But to get to these, it is necessary to also explain the political and economic background for the social development of each country. Germany and Austria had lost the war and were initially hit hard, mainly politically and economically. Both Austria and Germany lost their status as empires and, along with their great power status, lost significant territory and influence. For Germany, this resulted in first fear, unemployment, and resentment towards the Weimar government, then in a renaissance in culture and appreciation of American and German cultural elements. The Treaty of Versailles in 1919 caused Germany to lose control over its industrial Ruhr area, and Germany had to return the likewise industrial Alsace and Lorraine areas to France. In addition, all Germany's colonies in Africa and Asia were taken away. The result was unemployment and poverty, as it was difficult to reach trade agreements with other countries, and there were no colonies from which to import raw materials like oil and rubber. The streets were full of returned soldiers who could not find jobs and who resented the new German Weimar government. Everyday life became very unstable, as these Freikorps would be seen marching in the streets or involved in mass fights against communist groups. The economic situation became even worse during the hyperinflation of 1922-23. Prices rose uncontrollably. In 1918, a loaf of bread cost 0.63 marks. In November 1923, a loaf of bread cost 201 billion marks. The people hardest hit were those with savings: middle-class white-collar workers, apartment or house owners, and pensioners. Their entire life savings were reduced to nothing. The immediate result was a deep distrust in Chancellor Friedrich Ebert and the Weimar government, sparking Adolf Hitler and the small Nazi party to attempt a revolution in November 1923. The Germans did not believe they were the only ones to be blamed for the war, and they found it impossible to pay the large reparations. After 1924, new Chancellor Gustav Stresemann introduced a new currency, the Rentenmark, and was able to negotiate a loan of 800 million gold marks from the USA under the so-called Dawes Plan. Industry began to regenerate and people's lives got better. By 1928, German industrial production had reached its pre-war levels. This marks the second phase of the social effects of World War I. This phase was much more positive and optimistic. Germany had always prided itself of being a Kulturland, a land of culture, and even during the hyperinflation, there were still more than 30 active opera houses. Culture now completely revived. In 1923 to 24, the radio had begun broadcasting cultural events, and by the end of the 1920s, there were more than 5,000 cinemas. Germany's most famous actress, Marlene Dietrich, captivated everyone. Berlin, as always, became the center of German culture and entertainment, with 900 dance bands and countless art galleries. The constitution of the Weimar Republic allowed women to vote, and as women also entered the job market, they became part of a new consumer culture. German culture was heavily influenced by American culture, with jazz being the big craze. This was partly a result of the Dawes Plan and its generous loan to Germany. At the same time, though, a reactionary movement against modern avant-garde art and Americanism pervaded much of German society, and it is important to realize that the German people were quite divided over the cultural direction Germany was taking. This division was one of the things which the National Socialists later exploited in their call for a return to traditional German values. Austria fared less well. Under its peace treaty, the Treaty of Saint-Germain, 1919, the former Austro-Hungarian Empire was broken apart, and Austria alone now formed about 1/10 of its former empire. Hungary broke away, and Bohemia and Moravia became the new Czechoslovakia. Bosnia, Herzegovina, and Croatia were unified in the new state of Yugoslavia, causing Austria to lose its access to the Mediterranean Sea. The destruction of the empire had severe economic consequences. Most of the industry had been located in Bohemia and most agriculture in Hungary. Production halted, and unemployed soldiers in their thousands roamed the city streets. The constitution of the new Republic of Austria did allow women to vote, but there was little in the overall liberation of women and the creation of a consumer culture. The Austrian society and cultural development was pretty much at a standstill until it became part of the National Socialist Greater German Reich in 1938. As we can see, society, culture, and everyday life suffered severely in both Germany and Austria. But where Germany was able to re-engage its economy and social and cultural development after the Dawes Plan of 1924, Austria was not. The avant-garde of the cultural movement in Germany did, however, result in a strong conservative and reactionary movement, later exploited by the National Socialists. Austria took up this conservatism, and people cheered at the German soldiers when they entered Austria years later in 1938. For Britain, two main issues will be focused on: the severe economic hardship caused by the debt to the USA, and the lack of men of working and marrying age. Economic hardship could be dealt with as women kept entering the workforce, but it is estimated that 2 million women were left without the prospect of ever marrying and starting a family. During the course of the war, Britain and France had to borrow money and military equipment from the USA in order to keep fighting. From being one of the world's largest creditors, Britain was now among the largest debitors. About 40% of government spending went to interest payments on their loans. When the British government approached the USA for a lowering of the payments, US President Calvin Coolidge's blunt response was, "But they borrowed the money, didn't they?" As opposed to Germany, Britain and France did not reach agreement on loans for rebuilding the economy, but were left to themselves. Actually, the reparations given from Germany threatened to destroy the British coal industry, as much of the reparations were given in coal, resulting in a general strike of 2 million workers in 1926. About 750,000 men had been lost on the front, and many of the returning soldiers were so physically and mentally scarred from the fighting that they were unable to marry. In 1921, there were 1.7 million more women than men in Britain. These surplus women, as they became known, were able to enter the job market, although the trade and labor unions initially opposed it. Already in 1915, women had been allowed to work in the factories, heavily supported by the Defense of the Realm Act, the DORA, of August 1914. As a result of their support for the war effort, women over 30 had been allowed to vote already in 1918, and by that time about 1 million women were working in factories, offices, or the government. The British woman was thus emancipated and independent and had money to spend. However, going to a dance and seeing perhaps 5 to 6 men in a dance hall full of women did not pose well for a future with a family. Many women, especially the younger ones, chose to emigrate to Canada, South Africa, Australia, or New Zealand, especially when a column in the Times announced that there were 430,000 unmarried men in these areas of the world. As we see, one of the effects of Britain's fighting World War I was a lack of men of working and marrying age. While women could fill their places in their workspace, it became hard to start a family. Without a favorable negation of at least parts of its debts to the USA, Britain faced years of hard work in paying back debts for the war. America can be said to have been the only country to come out of World War I a winner. America had suffered relatively few losses in the war, and the industry at home had grown tremendously. This trend was to continue until the Wall Street crash in 1929. The USA had stayed neutral during almost the entire war. Apart from the money lent to Britain and France, American industry had boomed from producing military equipment, ammunition, and massive amounts of foodstuffs to be sold to the Allies. And while the European powers were exhausting each other in Europe, the Americans were able to move into European trade around the world. After the war, America exported less foodstuffs to Europe, resulting in poverty for many farmers. But the industry kept booming, switching now to household and consumer products. From 1919 to 1929, 21 million cars were produced, with, for example, one Ford Model T being made every 10 seconds. The number of telephones rose from 60,000 in 1919 to 10 million in 1929, and fridges and vacuum cleaners became stable household products. The rise in industry production and wealth became known as the Roaring Twenties. In 1920, all women in the USA had been given the vote, and especially working women of the cities became more liberated. They were seen wearing more daring clothes, promoted by the fashion industry, and might even smoke publicly. In rural America, this was not the case though. As in Germany, which followed many of the American trends, people in the countryside stuck to conservative values. More and more people had surplus money with which they could invest in stocks. Gradually, many of these investments were done on margin, meaning that you could borrow money based on what your stocks were expected to pay out if you later sold them. This caused an economic bubble, which finally burst in the panic of the stock market crash on Wall Street in October 1929, causing a worldwide recession. As seen, the USA came out of World War I stronger than before. Industry was well established and managed to switch from production of war materials to consumer products. Women were free and independent. The Roaring Twenties was a period of great prosperity, but the gradual build-up of fictive money on the stock market eventually caused the economy to collapse. The fire had burned itself out. It is probably fair to say that the most radical consequences of World War I took place in Russia. The Bolshevik Revolution of October 1917 transformed the conservative, aristocratic, feudal Russia into the world's first communist republic. Every aspect of Russian society, political, economic, and social, became communist, shaping daily life in radical new directions. The state nationalized all large factories and corporations, running them on behalf of the people. Traditional conservative family patterns were broken by laws allowing women to file for divorce and by the legalization of abortion. A decree on freedom of conscience in 1918 effectively broke the otherwise very powerful Orthodox Church. And obviously, the communists took away all privileges from the landowning aristocracy and, with a land reform, gave all the farmland to the peasants. In March 1918, Lenin and Trotsky signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, giving away half of Russia's industry in order to obtain peace. Obviously, there was resistance and opposition. From 1918 to 1920, a civil war swept over Russia as conservative Tsarist forces, with the help of foreign troops, tried to restore the old system. But in 1923, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, was formed. The war communism imposed by Lenin now gave way for a more relaxed production system in the countryside, the new economic policy, which allowed the peasants to sell off at least some of their own yields. But from 1928, the new leader of the USSR, Joseph Stalin, imposed a planned economy designed, as he stated himself, to get the USSR out of its 100 years of backwardness. The 5-year plans set production targets for each industry to get them going. Energy, pig iron, and steel were the main focus. The second 5-year plan, from 1933, focused on machinery for both industry and agriculture. People were removed from their villages to remote areas of the USSR to set up new industrial complexes such as Magnitogorsk and Sverdlovsk. The remaining peasants and workers in the cities were also given production targets and sent to work camps, gulags, if they did not meet them. The Communist Party placed their own officials in each village and factory to monitor production and root out dissent. From 1929, small villages were collectivized, put together in large production units, with all peasants working in unison on the collective land. By 1931, 52.7% of all land was collectivized. A secret police, the Cheka, later to be known as the NKVD, and later again the KGB, kept files on unruly workers and removed them if they caused trouble. Propaganda through radio, posters, and big parades celebrated the achievements of the communist way of life. Gradually, the USSR became a totalitarian system as working for the state filled up all aspects of the citizens' lives. A class struggle was proclaimed in which Stalin wanted to eliminate all conservative and capitalist elements in society. The main target became the kulaks, so-called wealthy peasants, and sometimes whole villages were uprooted and shipped to Siberia to establish themselves in new farming collectives or to work on dams and canals. The process of dekulakization aimed at eliminating the kulaks as a class. In 1930 to 31 alone, 1.8 million kulaks were deported. Women might have been considered equal to men, with 40% of industrial workers and 21% of building workers being women by 1937. But in a totalitarian system, voting matters little, and democracy became an empty phrase. As we see, probably no country changed so much as Russia as a consequence of World War I. The war became the catalyst for a complete transformation of the Russian society, from aristocratic tsardom to communist totalitarianism. Millions of Russians died, were imprisoned, or sent to work camps in the process, and there was much suffering. Nevertheless, the Soviet economy did improve. From 1928 to 1937, the production of electricity rose by 600%, coal more than 400%, oil almost 200%, and steel by 400%. But with everything dictated by a single party, with few consumer goods and no political or intellectual freedom, and the constant threat of a secret police taking away you and your family, everyday life for the ordinary citizen was hard and dangerous. Great optimism in the communist revolution among people were mixed with the fear of the NKVD. As many as 20 to 30 million people died in prisons or gulags from work accidents and famine. In conclusion, we see how World War I affected the various participants in very different ways. At the same time, the trends were quite similar. World War I was a watershed event. The loss of millions of men and the fact that World War I had been fought as a total war had changed production and ushered women into the job market. In all the discussed countries, women were given the right to vote, which would influence policies and culture hereafter. In many ways, the societies which emerged after the Great War are the societies we know of today. Before the war, the women would have stayed at home taking care of the family. As women became able to support themselves, there would also be a bigger tendency to file for divorce if a marriage was unhappy, or people might choose not to marry at all. The roaring 20s of American industry and the rise in disposable income resulted in the rise of the new consumer industry and a change of culture. People went out to enjoy themselves. Jazz became popular and the film industry boomed. Cheaper radio sets helped spread popular culture, although some governments would later use these as an effective tool for propaganda. World War I ushered the world into the 20th century industrialized society. The war itself had been the first mass war involving millions of soldiers and the efforts of the entire societies behind them. This spilled over into the creation of the mass society with mass production, mass consumption, and mass culture. Whether these masses were capable at creating a better world for themselves would be a question for the whole century.
This concludes this episode of the 20th Century History Series podcast. Music for the intro and outro and throughout this episode was made by Andrea LaRose. To download more of these podcasts or to leave a comment, please visit www.historypodcast.net. Thank you for listening.